Hello, everyone, and welcome to our March First Friday webinar. This month we have Matt Cox supporting the sexual, gender, and identity development of religiously conservative students. Remember, at the end, we will have a little assessment/survey that I'll put in the comments or in the live chat. For the live chat, just make sure to sign into a Google account, and it should be on the right side underneath the video, and you can go ahead and ask any questions, and I'll make sure that I get those over to Matt. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Matt, and you can go ahead and get started.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Matt Cox, and this webinar Northwest NWACUHO, and unfortunately I could not be there because of the snow apocalypse. So I'm really glad to be with you all digitally. So we'll get started. First off, a little about me. Again, my name is Matt Cox. There's my picture so you can see experience working in higher education. I'm currently in a mid-level position in residence life at Seattle Pacific. As far as education, I have a master's degree in business administration, a master's in theology, and a nearly complete master's in counseling. And my pronouns are he and him. So before we dive in, a little overview of where we're going to be going and what we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to be talking about sex, gender, gender identity, sexuality, and conservative faith. We're going to be talking about three overarching experiences or attitudes that may permeate conservative religious systems that will impact our students and their sexuality and gender identities. We're going to talk about 5 techniques for supporting and journeying with students. And we're going to talk about some of the unique needs of LGBTQ+ religiously conservative students. Now, these topics will hit home for us. They may challenge us, they may trigger us, they may frustrate us, depending on our background. And I want to acknowledge that from the outset and acknowledge that there may be ways in which I make a mistake. I'm striving to be inclusive and considerate and thoughtful, but I'm also open to your feedback as we go through this or at the end. And despite the challenge associated with these topics and the ways it may impact us, these topics are also lived realities for many of our students. And for that reason, I hope they're worth our time. Now, one more thing I want to check in on is just our terminology before we get started. So first I want to talk about sexuality. For our purposes, we will define sexuality as a facet of our being that incorporates orientation, desires for partnership, romance, and sexual or erotic activity, and is also related to but distinct from gender and assigned or biological sex traits. It's also, I think, sometimes helpful to consider sexuality in ways that might be that might seem old-fashioned or Freudian, but to consider sexuality also as simply a part of our energy or life force that permeates a lot of aspects of our being. And now when we're talking about gender, of course, we're talking about a social construct. Historically, gender has often been defined by binary polarities of maleness and femaleness, and we've seen gender through those lenses. Of course, numerous additional gender identities and expressions exist within and outside of those polarities. Finally, when we're talking about religion, we're talking, for our purposes, about a system of beliefs and practices that expresses and facilitates a relationship with an espoused ultimate reality, spirituality, and or God. And of course, all of these concepts are influenced by intersecting factors related to culture and history and ethnicity and race and power and privilege and things that are important to note, but of course we don't have time to fully unpack in a webinar. Now, when we're talking about conservative religion and sexuality, and gender identity, three common factors are going to be important for us to consider today. First, conservative religious systems will often have standards for sexual behavior that are heavily associated with purity or worthiness. Conservative religious systems will have prohibitions against LGBTQ sexuality and gender, LGBTQ plus sexuality and gender identities. And conservative religious systems will often have prescribed gender roles and elements of patriarchy. Now, regarding conservative religious systems, evangelical Protestantism, Catholicism, Mormon or Latter-day Saints, and Islam are often the most common conservative faith systems we may encounter. And these faith systems in general will have more conservative sexual ideals. Of course, none of these groups are completely homogenous or monolithic. One Muslim group doesn't speak for all of Islam. One evangelical church doesn't speak for all of evangelical Protestantism. It's also worth noting that many students who come from or practice these faith orientations can describe positive aspects of their faith, even as it relates to their sexuality. That being said, this presentation, and for that reason, this presentation should not be perceived as being anti-faith or anti-spirituality or anti-conservative religion. That's not my goal. I hope this presentation is simply received as being pro-health, pro-wellness, pro-thriving for our students. And with that in mind, it's important to note that students coming from these faiths are often ill-equipped to transition into a grown-up or mature understanding of sex, sexuality, and gender. Now, I want to pause right here and just note that if you have questions, you can submit those, and when there's a natural break in the presentation or at the end, we'll try to give some space to those questions. But before we go on to some of the specific techniques, I want to take a moment to discuss a few hypothetical students. As we're discussing these students, if you have something you're taking notes with, I invite you to also make some notes of what your reactions are. Where do you feel assumptions or biases rising up? Where do you feel yourself pushing back or leaning in? Because that'll be important in a moment. And it's also important to know that all these students are hypothetical. They're constructed case studies that I've built, but they are also indicative of conversations I have had when supporting students from religiously conservative backgrounds. So let's meet Kevin. Kevin is a third-year cisgendered male student and RA. Kevin was raised in the Mormon or Latter-day Saint church, and this is still an important part of who he is. Kevin comes to you, his supervisor, to discuss sexuality. He opens up about finding men sexually attractive, but he also questions if his desires are acceptable. And in his words, he describes struggling with what he calls same-sex attraction. Kevin goes on to explain, I used to think this would go away or that maybe I could just deal with it somehow. I'm not so sure anymore. I am sure that if I explain this to my family or church, they won't understand. I feel like I need to choose between hiding this or losing my faith and my community back home. I'd also like to introduce you to Jessica, a hypothetical second-year cisgendered female student. Jessica grew up in an evangelical Christian church. Her community was steeped in the 90s and early 2000s purity movement. If you don't know what the evangelical purity movement was, it's a movement within Protestant Christianity primarily that espoused certain notions of sexual purity, such as abstinence till marriage, and in some cases even replacing dating with notions like courtship and waiting to, even in some cases, waiting to kiss until someone was married. And of course, all of this was focused on heteronormative relationships. And this is Jessica's context for growing up. Some pretty specific and strong notions of what purity meant and what being unpure also meant. And Jessica feels conflicted about her choices regarding sexuality. And she finds her way to you after a recent event on sexual health and explains her dilemma as follows. According to Jessica, when I go home to my church and family, I feel terrible about the choices I've made around sexual activity. When I talk with friends here, no one understands. My boyfriend comes from a similar background, and we don't know what we're doing, if it's right, or if what we're doing is safe. That's Jessica. The final hypothetical student I want to introduce you to is Treyton. Treyton is a fourth-year student. Treyton grew up Muslim and still practices Islam today and considers it an important part of his life. Treyton has always believed their assigned gender, male, didn't match their actual gender identity. And Treyton has started to use they, them as pronouns and lean into other elements of a gender identity they describe as gender fluid. But Treyton worries about what family members and members of their mosque may say. Treyton explains, I want to be myself when I go home, but I don't want to upset my community and family. Should I just pretend to be he instead of they? Should I still join them in at my mosque for prayer? Now, before we move in, I hope we can just take a moment to check in on our own biases. All these students are hypothetical students facing real dilemmas, real life choices, and conflicts between beliefs they hold dearly and an emerging sense of self, and or a sense of identity and orientation. The reactions we have to these students, to their sexuality, to their faith, to their gender identity, will bleed into our relationships and can result in two specific risks that I want to highlight today. A first risk is that students retreat from a potentially supportive relationship with a student affairs professional. The second risk is that we, as student affairs professionals, can become a new and potentially biased source of external authority. Any one of these hypothetical students could have likely come from a background in which a strong degree of authority was placed external to the student. Some of this is developmentally natural, but in their cases, it may not set them up well to embrace, explore, and understand their own gender identity and sexuality. If we rush in with bias, we can risk becoming simply the next external authority. And I think that's probably not anything any of us wish for as we support our students. All right, so we're going to move on to revisit the 3 common experiences and then talk about 5 techniques. I do want to just pause for a moment. I'll pause for a minute. If there are any questions, our moderator, Andrew, this is a point where our moderator, Andrew, could step in. All right, I'll continue. So, I briefly want to review the 3 common factors we talked about that typically that are common among conservative religious systems in regards to faith, sex, and gender. First are standards for sexual behavior associated with purity and worthiness. Now, the potential impact of this is shame-based trauma and an absence of education. Now, almost all organizations and groups, if they're large enough, will have some sort of standard, either explicit or implicit, for sexual behavior. But when those standards regarding sexuality and gender identity become explicitly associated with purity or worthiness, there is a significant risk of shame-based trauma, because no one always at all times lives up to all standards, especially when they are high. They can also, these standards can also result in an absence of education because we don't talk about what we associate with shame, or because of the fear that talking about sexuality will lead to choices about sexuality. The second factor we discussed were prohibitions against LGBTQ sexual and gender identities. This can result in denial for students who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community. It can result in prejudice, and that can be internal oppression or external prejudice. And it can result in maladaptive coping mechanisms as a student attempts to keep something so core to themselves hidden from others or from themselves. Finally, we discussed the idea that prescribed gender roles and patriarchy are a common factor amongst most conservative faith systems. This can result in a few things. One, the gender roles are almost always unrealistic. For one, they're binary. For another, they're highly prescriptive. And this can also result in an oppressive denial of female sexuality. Many women growing up in a conservative faith environment, especially if it's more on the fundamental side of things, can feel very separated from their own sexuality, which they consider to be, or is sometimes explicitly stated to be, in the service only of men and only in marriage. So those are a few common factors that I wanted to review, and I wanted to touch on their impacts. For our students who grow up in this sort of environment with these three common factors and the ways it can influence their sexual and gender identity development, there are 5 techniques I want to offer. And we'll begin with technique 1. Technique 1 is pretty simple, at least to state and explain. It's being accepting and safe. And what I mean by that is programs and person-to-person interactions should feel safe for the student's sexuality and for their faith identity. This isn't always easy to do when we have assumptions about that identity. And so safe and accepting, but I do want to state that safe and accepting does not mean an absence of challenge or critical thinking. As with any other part of life in the university, students should encounter worldviews, ideas that challenge their own and offer them a deeper perspective. That being said, safe and accepting does mean checking our assumptions. Safe and accepting also means reducing all or nothing thinking and labels. And safe and accepting can also mean prioritizing understanding over solutions. Now, I don't know about any of you, but as I walk through those vignettes, those students, I can find myself, of the 3 students we started with at the beginning, I can find myself thinking of where I want the conversation to go, things I hope we discuss, outcomes. But I think there's an old adage that I've heard that is relevant here, and that's if we feel like we can solve someone's problem in 5 minutes, it either isn't a problem or we haven't listened long enough. And in addition to that simple wisdom about the value of listening, for these students from conservative religious backgrounds have often bifurcated off a part of themselves or parts of themselves for some time, and creating a space that is safe to hold tension, that prioritizes understanding, can give them the space to bring themselves back into a room and to simply come into contact with themselves again. So our first technique is simply being safe and accepting. Just want to check in if there are any questions at this point. Andrew, are we good to keep going?
Yep. Sorry, it takes me a second to unmute myself there, but yeah.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. So our second technique is educating, and specifically teaching sexual development as a process. So many of us may remember from classes on sexuality or human growth and development that sexual development is a journey that involves growth and learning. Now, that being said, conservative religious systems often construe sexual development as consisting of 2 stages. Stage 1 is absence, absent before marriage, and stage 2 is sexually filled after a heteronormative marriage. Now, in the minds of many young people, the result for our students can be 0% sexual before marriage and 1000% sexual and completely satisfied after a heteronormative marriage. And these extremes obviously don't line up to lived experiences. So the need here is to help students understand sexuality as a developmental and learning journey. And there are a lot of great resources that you can access pretty easily to help construct programming or education around this topic. If you simply look up lifespan of sexual development or sexual development stages, you can find a lot of good resources. I would encourage you to look for resources and schemas that include developmental tasks, not just stats, and that include relational considerations such as consent and understanding one's own desires. At the end of this Prezi, I've included a citation for one such resource. So our second tool is simply educating about a sexual development process. Our third tool is exploring origins. Religiously conservative students can benefit from having someone help them examine their own assumptions without passing judgment on those assumptions. So, in many religiously conservative contexts, rules and assumptions about sex and gender often are accepted as kind of brute facts, things that just are. And in this way, they can take on kind of what in Latin would be called an ex nihilo quality, something that exists without origin. And when something exists without origin, it often also exists without question. So a resource we can provide to our students is simply curiosity. This can take the form of simple questions such as, well, where did blank belief come from? How long do you remember believing blank about blank? Questions like this, if asked without judgment and without assumption or pressure of what the answer should be, can help students explore origins to their own beliefs, values, and sexual mores, and in doing so can help them make decisions about what they want to own and about the emerging version of themselves that they are becoming in the moment as a university student. So a third technique is exploring origins. Fourth technique is expanding psychological flexibility. So fundamental religious systems often promote psychological inflexibility. And this is for a simple reason that has complex implications. So in many conservative systems, especially those that would lean towards what we might call a fundamental orientation, in those sort of systems and religious orientations, every teaching is considered of the utmost importance. They hold together like a brick wall. There's strength to it, but there is no flexibility. And if every element or teaching is of the utmost importance and beyond question, a challenge to one idea is a challenge to all. Just like removing one brick from a brick wall threatens the whole wall. So we can help support our students by expanding psychological flexibility. This can look like a few things. One, it can look like reducing the urgency to resolve inner conflict. In a conversation with a student, it can be helpful to say, what if we don't resolve this today? To ask a student to explore, what would it look like if you could live without the answer or resolution for a day, for a week? For many students, the ability to live in tension is an important step towards expanding psychological flexibility. This can also look like moving from dualism and either or thinking to commitment, to thinking in which a student owns their choices around sexuality and gender. And by owning them, they can also take on a certain degree of flexibility in that. For more on this, you can look at William Perry's theory of moral development. Finally, we can help students explore what they consider to be essential, and in doing so, what also might be peripheral in their worldview or their faith. And I have a simple activity that you can do with students to promote this. And this can be about any topic, not just sexuality and gender. You just grab a piece of paper and draw a circle in the middle and explain that this circle represents core beliefs. And a list of core beliefs should be smaller. It should be things that will likely have a relatively stable shelf life. These aren't tossed out and exchanged easily. If part of a worldview, a political view, or a faith system, other things are often built on top of these. And then you add some concentric circles to your sheet of paper. And note that the last circle, the most outward one, represents peripheral beliefs, things that maybe are more transient or that have a much smaller impact. And then you can simply have the student fill in elements of this circle. Maybe start with the centermost circle and then the outermost. And many students from religiously conservative backgrounds will find that their beliefs about gender and sexuality are not actually part of the core, but instead represent somewhere along the center. And in doing so, this allows for psychological flexibility. It allows for space to make choices. And again, this exercise shouldn't be done with an eye towards a certain outcome, towards making them either stick with or step away from a faith orientation, but instead as simply giving them tools to explore their own faith orientation and its relationship to sexuality and gender. Our fifth technique is simply empowering students with agency and responsibility concerning their own sexuality. And this is especially important for female students whose religious upbringing has included patriarchal oppression concerning sexuality. As we kind of touched on earlier, for many female students who are raised in a religiously conservative background, elements of patriarchy may explicitly or implicitly espouse a denial of sexuality, a denial of autonomy regarding sexuality, or may simply imply that sexuality is something that should be bifurcated off and then will someday be in service of a heteronormative marriage. Some optional learning activities we can incorporate are things like consent training. I hope this is a part of what all our campuses do for all our students. It's something that's so important for a myriad of reasons, but it's also very empowering for students who have for so long felt a separateness from their own wants, desires, and ability to say yes or no to those desires and how they get expressed in relationships. Additionally, we can encourage students to reflect on their desired romantic and sexual experiences, to simply have the tools to name what they want and do not want. And finally, and this is more of a higher level activity, writing out a sexual legacy. This is something espoused by a therapist in Seattle named Tina Sellers, a PhD who has written extensively on shame-based sexual trauma. And as sort of a higher order intervention or supporting technique for a student who has started to do the exploration, a technique can be simply writing out a sexual legacy, encouraging someone to explore, to imagine themselves at 50, 60, 80 years of age and to turn around and say, what do I want my lived experience with sexuality to have been? What do I want the impact of that lived experience to be? And in doing reflections like these, it enables a student, enables an individual to take ownership of their sexuality, to feel empowered regarding that sexuality, and to take on some internal locus of control regarding sexuality. So I'm going to pause here for just a second, and if there are any questions, we can take them. Otherwise, we can keep going.
I'm not seeing questions right now, but it does remember that there's a little bit of a time between when we are speaking and when it's showing up for
Totally.
our, so if you all have any questions, please feel free to ask them at any point, and we'll make sure to pose them to Matt.
All right. Well, I'm going to transition now to talking about a few special considerations. So a few special considerations for religiously conservative LGBTQ plus students. Religiously conservative LGBTQ plus students face some unique challenges, and supporting these students may involve a few specific things. It should be noted here that the research I'm drawing on for some of these elements comes from a group of researchers who has worked extensively with LGBTQ plus adolescents and young adults in the Mormon or Latter-day Saints community. And so this research comes from a specific demographic group, but I think it has some potential application. It should be noted that that in that particular group, many LGBTQ plus students face an additional challenge of having less real and perceived optionality of changing faith systems or changing places of worship or faith community. In some faith systems, you can move to a place of worship down the street and find something that will be that might consider a church or a place of worship that might consider itself open and affirming. For the students who are part of this research, the young persons who are part of this research, that was not an option. So that does flavor the research that informs this next slide, but I hope it's still informative. So one element that's important when supporting religiously conservative LGBTQ plus students is making space for grief. And this is important even when we want to celebrate what may seem like their newfound freedom. Students from religiously conservative communities may experience grief before and during the process of coming out to themselves, because doing so for many may mean closing off other options of being a part of and connecting with their own faith community. It may mean closing off or jeopardizing relationships with family. For some, it may also involve real risks to physical or psychological well-being as they face oppression and bias. And so for these reasons, this making space for grief is an important step for many religiously conservative LGBTQ plus students. And it can simply involve, as we see them, if we're in a conversation and we see that student in tension, it can involve a simple question like, I'm curious, is there anything as you explore this choice of coming out, or as you explore your identity, that you're nervous for? Anything, or you can even use the language, is there anything you are grieving or potentially giving up as you come out to yourself or others? Doing so can allow them to name and feel like they have someone to join with in their grieving. And again, this is important even as we may want to celebrate with them. It can also look like allowing space for students to modify or adjust their spirituality so as to embrace their sexuality and gender. In the research on adolescents and young adults from the Mormon faith who are coming out as LGBTQ plus or living closeted with an LGBTQ plus identity orientation, what they found is that many moved through stages that involved first trying to deny their sexual orientation or gender orientation, and then attempting to modify their faith and modify their gender orientation and sexual orientation, and then trying to reconcile both. On an interesting note, there has been some work to describe what has been called sometimes called a Rumspringa effect. I hope I'm pronouncing that German word correctly. It comes from the Amish community term for allowing someone. It literally means the devil. I think it means the devil's playground or devil's weekend, and comes from a term in Amish communities where you allow someone coming of age to leave the faith, experience the world outside of the Amish community, and make a choice to come back or not. And often this is known for being a wild process. Now, what does that have to do with religiously conservative LGBTQ plus students? When a religiously conservative LGBTQ plus adolescent or young adult is suddenly forced out of to make a choice about their religion or spirituality, or suddenly forced to make a choice about their sexual or gender identity, rash choices can result and have that sort of Rumspringa effect. People can renounce their faith orientation, but then begin to make reckless choices regarding sexuality. People can renounce their sexuality and make a reckless choice regarding their faith orientation. For example, choosing to be in a marriage that appears heteronormative, but in which they are closeted. So this act of simply allowing space for students to go through a process of modifying or adjusting their spirituality so as to embrace their sexual and gender identity can be helpful and in some way protective. even if we feel like we want to rush them to a choice or a conclusion. And of course, it's also important for us to pay attention to safety. Like I hinted at before, students may face real physical and psychological threats to their safety. And that's something that I think is always worth checking in as we see someone in a place of tension regarding what their sexual or gender orientation means as they think about going back to a community that may not be accepting. So those are a few special considerations. And I want to head back. I want to return to our 3 students as we get ready to wrap up and conclude. So we began this by talking about Kevin, our hypothetical Mormon student who is seems to be in a process of coming out to himself regarding his sexual orientation. We talked about Jessica, our evangelical purity movement student who has lots of questions about safety, about what's okay, and about how she can go back to a community she cares about and yet still live with choices she desires and wants now regarding sexuality. And we talked about Treyton, our hypothetical Muslim student who has recently embraced his understanding or their understanding of their own gender, but now questions what that means for them as they return home to their community. And I have a few things I'd like you to consider. One, is there any specific technique or consideration from our time together this morning that you would use in meeting with an individual student? Maybe one of the hypothetical ones we discussed, or maybe a student you know and are supporting now. 2, is there any specific technique or consideration you would apply to your own programs and events regarding sexuality and gender? My hope for our time together is that there has been something valuable for you that will help us as we seek to support these and other students. In truth, some of the things we've discussed are also relevant for any student considering and stepping into the next version of themselves and their next more authentic version of their own gender and sexual identities. So that's my hope. And as we conclude and leave a little space for any questions, I just want to say thank you. I hope everyone can walk away with something of value or use. I also welcome your feedback. I know there'll be a manner for submitting that through this webinar platform, but I also want to welcome your feedback. You can send that directly to me also at mattcox@spu.edu. We can also just continue a conversation that way. These presentation slides are available at the web address listed there. And finally, our slides also contain a few resources that I reference or mention. This is some of the source material here. I hope some of this can be useful for you if you want to explore further. So that's our presentation on supporting the sexual and gender identity development of religiously conservative students. Thank you for your time, and I want to leave a little space if there are questions, comments. Yeah, so I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thanks for that great presentation. We will have just a little bit of time here to wait for questions. I did post the assessment and feedback form on the group chat on the YouTube page, so please use that if you'd like to give some feedback. We do have a few comments here. One's from Tiffany Firestone. I've appreciated you making space for this topic. It's so important for us to acknowledge the challenges of folks being in the LGBTQ plus community and in a religious community. Thank you. And then another comment here from Janie. Is the research you would recommend that specifically looks at the experience of trans students?
I know some of the most of the research on religiously conservative students that has also and sexuality that I've seen has focused specifically on LGBTQ plus population, specifically on homosexual populations and persons is related to sexual orientation and not as much to gender orientation. So in this presentation, I've tried to use some of that learning insight and just mix with just good psychological and therapeutic principles and developmental principles. But unfortunately, there is not as much research out there. In some of the resources I've added after the conclusion, there's some reference, but I don't have a really great, solid, just crushes it resource regarding trans students and from religiously conservative communities. And I'm sorry about that.
All right, and then we had another comment here from Bob Lambert that says, "Thank you, Matthew. Very informative and thorough."
Oh, well, thank you.
All right. Well, this always happens like right at the end. I cut it off too soon, so I'm going to ramble just a little bit longer in case we have any other questions. But I just do want to thank you again, Matthew, for talking about this topic. Like I said, the assessment is in the comments there. If you'd go ahead and take that. Next month, we'll have another presentation. I'm forgetting the title right now, but it is dealing with religious institutions within higher education. So we're going to kind of keep on somewhat of the same theme here with religion and student development. But seeing no other questions, Matthew, do you have any last comments that you'd like to say?
I just want to say to everyone, thank you for taking the time today. Thank you for, leaning into a topic that I think is important, but can also be easy to overlook for some, but is relevant to the students it impacts. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. And we're going to go ahead and call it a day. Thank you all for attending. We'll see you next month.